So I've been trying to develop a sport jacket based on German Gothic armor, but I think I have accidentally designed something for Battlestar Galactica instead. Now, what is it about my prototype that is giving more of a Galactic Imperium impression than a 15th century one? To answer this question, let's talk about the visual language of science fiction. What materials, silhouettes, and symbols have been firmly integrated into our mental picture of the future? What styles immediately feel advanced to our eye? And how do aesthetics support the social commentary that is inherent to many of these stories? I'll be using the lens of film and television to present a broad overview of the evolution of costuming in science fiction over the course of the last 100 years, organizing our discussion across 6 influential aesthetics: steampunk, Antiquity as future, mid-century retrofuturism, sterile space, World War forever, and cyberpunk. By the end of our analysis, we may come to some understanding of the intention behind these design choices. Namely, how does the way we style the future reflect our hopes and our fears for it? So without further ado, let's start at the very beginning. Here in 2025, we think of steampunk as a retrofuturistic aesthetic characterized by Victorian settings contrasted with wondrous fictional inventions. But we have to remember that to artists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this look was not retro at all, but a reimagining of their present. In a period that witnessed seismic technological shifts across all facets of daily life, the human imagination buzzed with both wonder and dread. Technology rapidly enabled extraordinary developments across industry, medicine, and transportation, while at the same time, critics feared that dire consequences might follow. For example, with the construction of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869, distant tourism now became more accessible, where previously it had been the exclusive luxury of the ultra-rich. And works such as Jules Verne's 1873 novel Around the World in 80 Days really captured that optimistic energy, bubbling with the excitement of possibilities enabled by new technology. But even within that same example, critics feared the physiological effects of travel by rail. The medical publication The Lancet published The Influence of Railway Traveling on Public Health in 1862, which included very valid reporting on the grave injuries resulting from railway accidents, but also warned of the seriousness of secondary effects, such as it being rather tiring to read on dimly lit and shaky rail cars, that conversation is more fatiguing when you have to talk over ambient noise, and that it is very stressful to have to wake up early to catch your train on time. You know what though, they might have a point. Science may have gone too far. But this push and pull between the wonder and curiosity enabled by technological progress, in tension with the fear of its perhaps unforeseeable or perhaps preventable consequences, remains to this day one of the core themes of science fiction, which we see reflected in even the earliest sci-fi films. The very first science fiction film is widely regarded to be Georges Méliès's 1902 work, A Trip to the Moon. Inspired by Jules Verne's novels From the Earth to the Moon and its sequel Around the Moon, I'm not even 5 minutes into this video and moon is starting to feel like a fake word. A Trip to the Moon is a fascinating look at space travel in the early 20th century imagination. This film was made 67 years before the first actual moonwalk, and so we see a certain naivete about space exploration. The astronaut characters don't wear helmets or protective suits of any kind because people in 1902 had no concept of breathable atmosphere or the dangers of radiation. But there's something rather charming about the innocence of a bunch of scientists just wandering around the lunar surface in lounge coats, knickerbockers, and knee-high stockings. Though I would be remiss to not mention the unsurprising imperialist overtones of the post-Victorian era, with the native Selenites imagined as violent yet fragile savages and objects of curiosity. But overall, this film is playful, triumphant, and represents that optimistic orientation toward technology that, to people of this time, must have still felt a lot like magic. We see that whimsy reflected in the costuming of the astrology club, where their long robes, pointy hats, and cartoonish beards give more of a wizardly impression than a scientific one. By contrast, such films as the 1910 adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the 1920 adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, speak to that darker imagining of scientists so driven by curiosity that they did not ask if they should after they determined that they could. Steampunk remains such a compelling aesthetic for science fiction because it calls back to a society on the cusp of momentous transformation. At once eager to usher in new possibilities for a better world, but jaded by the naked greed of industrial robber barons and the injustice of continuing class tensions. But as time goes on, the focus of science fiction writers begins to expand from reimagining familiar settings with fantastical inventions to dreaming of completely alien landscapes separated from present-day Earth by time or by space. So what might that distant future look like? When it came to imagining what people might be wearing 500 years from now, artists of the early 20th century fascinatingly turned to anachronism for their inspiration, using historical garments of the classical period, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance as basis for their alien or futuristic costume. The Phantom Empire, a wacky Western plus science fiction film serial from 1935, is a great example of this aesthetic. In this scene alone, we see a bunch of historical references from all over the place, from this exaggerated neck ruff, reminiscent of the fashion in 17th century Western Europe, to these conical helmets that evoke Ottoman helmets of the 16th century, as well as this guy over here who is wearing kind of a silly Atlantica-inspired getup. Now, I've heard it argued that this costuming was just a result of borrowing resources from other film sets to make these cheap serials. I mean, just look at this little adorable robot head that they made out of cardboard and spray painted silver. Like, that's the kind of budget we're talking about. But I think that explanation severely underestimates the intentionality at play here. Classical history-inspired costuming predates these film serials in the comics and pulp fiction of the early 20th century, popularized by Buck Rogers in 1929 and its famous imitator Flash Gordon in 1934. These illustrated adventures feature such medieval themes as extraterrestrial soldiers in stylized plate armor, alien monarchs holding court atop ornate thrones, damsels in distress wearing, well, nothing actually historical, but you may feel like this costume is very familiar because of how often it's been copied into the present. When Flash Gordon gets the silver screen treatment as a film serial in 1936, it does borrow footage and props from other productions. But the costumes themselves are very faithful to the original comics and seem custom-made for their purpose, right down to the Mongol soldiers' rather unfortunate butt armor. In 1936, we also get the H.G. Wells film Things to Come, which also employs historical inspiration for its futuristic fashions. I would say these capes and draping borrow from the Greek himation, but those vests that protrude over the shoulders evoke Japanese garments, like the samurai kataginu of the Edo period. And again, we see armor being a huge inspiration for futuristic costume in this film, which will remain a visual motif in science fiction into the present day. I think it comes down to the fact that when you think about preparing a person for space, particularly if they might meet an extraterrestrial enemy, you think about putting them in a protective suit. And what is the best visual handle for protective suits that we have? It's armor. I think history is such a clever handle for these design choices because it immediately transports you in time, even if that time might be in the past. You know at first glance from these outfits that you are somewhere else besides present-day Earth. Further, they speak to a sense of regression or to the cyclical nature of history, since so many of these stories feature democratic republics collapsing into autocracy, fresh world wars erupting after periods of peace, or vibrant societies eventually falling into technological decay. It makes sense to use historically earlier, more primitive garments as a visual cue to signal society having started over, repeating the mistakes of the past. Speaking of repeating mistakes, let's talk about how the look of science fiction changes after the Second World War. The 1950s are regarded as the golden age of science fiction theater, and it is no wonder. This decade produced more sci-fi films than any other to date, with at least 204 titles released between 1950 and 1959. We see a thematic expansion after the Second World War, with films investigating fears of apocalypse following the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, of infiltration as McCarthyism grips the United States, and of depersonalization as veterans return home, searching for meaning in a civilian life characterized by conformity and consumerism. A growing body of films feels less optimistic or playful than the pulp of previous decades, imagining fewer exciting futures in lieu of a present full of catastrophe, alien invasion, and body snatchers. Yet this is the same era that produced not only The Day the Earth Stood Still and The War of the Worlds, but also I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver. The juxtaposition of saccharine nostalgia with grim dystopia remains a fascinating combination for artists and writers today, inspiring contemporary works like Fallout or The Iron Giant, which very explicitly reference the material culture of the 50s in their art direction, or films such as The Stepford Wives, which may not have modeled themselves after the visual language of the 50s, but which embrace similar themes of blithe hedonism belying systemic evils. The 50s also sees the beginning of the space race, where the United States and Soviet Union compete to send humanity to the stars. For the first time, fictional spaceflight begins to have a real point of reference in the equipment developed for the genuine article. So how does our image of the future change when it seems that it is already upon us? perhaps as a reflection of post-war visual movements like brutalism, which rejected nostalgia and decoration in design, and minimalism, which was concerned with eliminating non-essential forms to reveal the true essence of an object. A colder aesthetic of science fiction crystallizes in the 1960s. Designers imagine a future that is rigid, clean, and machine-perfect. The capstone of this sort of sterile vision of the future is Stanley Kubrick's 1968 masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey. The sets and costumes are cold, glowing, and synthetic, enhancing the eerie stillness of the cinematography. This shift in aesthetics is probably also inspired by new technology, as the broader availability of synthetic materials in fashion during the 60s invites new possibilities for design. Spandex was invented in 1958, facilitating skin-tight silhouettes that weren't achievable with previous materials. Fluorescent dyes, used in advertisements as early as 1937, begin to have wider application in consumer products and fashion. The neon space cat suit is sort of a goofy trope to us today, but in its context, it truly represented technological advancement. Now, I'm going to slot in a quick discussion of the original 1966 Star Trek here, because the vibrancy of its costumes and cheerfulness of its tone stands in opposition to the broader trend towards grim, emotionless science fiction. Launched 2 years after the Civil Rights Act, its brand of campy optimism is also distinct from that of the pulp era because it represents a vision for the future where progress is not only achieved by technology, but by the triumph of the human spirit. Where much of science fiction leverages spaceflight as a vehicle for colonialism, Star Trek imagines galactic exploration as a conduit for curiosity. I'm obviously showing my allegiance to the superior sci-fi franchise with Star in its name, but I guess we could talk about the other one. Star Wars is one of the most influential science fiction franchises for a variety of reasons, but here I want to credit the original trilogy for really establishing the look of evil space factions. The design of the Galactic Empire uniforms has become synonymous with totalitarian regime of the future through visual references to militaristic empires of the past, projecting power, command, and fear. These costumes are directly inspired by, if not largely copied from, military uniforms of the First and Second World Wars. For example, this jacket design is taken directly from the Royal Flying Corps officer's quote-unquote maternity-style tunic from World War I. This hat is inspired by a World War II Japanese uniform, and these trousers tucked into tall jack boots references the World War II German Army field uniform. But color also plays an important part in projecting authoritarianism, as all-black uniform is closely associated with the Italian black shirts of Mussolini's fascist regime, and this palette of black, red, white, and gray-green borrows the colors of the SS and German Army field uniforms of the 1930s and 40s. Nazis have become such a symbol of evil in our culture that even though these costumes don't exactly match the construction of German uniforms, the design so strongly evokes an era of devastating global conflict that the association remains. Now, whenever Hollywood dresses an authoritarian military of the stars, we see the same features of an ultra-tailored silhouette, high stand collar, and lapels with facing patches for that extra fascist flair. But when the villains of our stories shift from imperial generals to corporate oligarchs, and our protagonists shift from virtuous heroes to rugged scoundrels, how does our mental picture of the future change once more? Cyberpunk emerges as a distinct subgenre of science fiction in the early 1980s, blending this glittering image of a high-tech future with grim urban decay. Solidified by seminal works such as Ridley Scott's 1982 film Blade Runner and William Gibson's 1984 novel Neuromancer, the genre depicts advanced metropolises dominated by artificial intelligence, corrupt megacorporations, and underground crime networks. Cyberpunk presents a world in which technology is both disruptor and enhancer of human experience, and so its costuming must be a study in contrast. The tension between technological advancement and social rot, between control and rebellion. Naturally, designers turned to the punk movements of the 1970s and early 1980s as the obvious reference point for anti-establishment fashion. And so we see Cyberpunk borrow the symbolic leather jackets, mohawks, and tattoos of alternative subculture, combined with futuristic elements such as neon colors, metallic fabrics, and cybernetic body modifications. We also see the costuming of these films emphasize class division, contrasting the worn, weathered appearance of undercity characters with the clean, minimal fashion of their corporate overlords. Borrowing from the sterile future precedent we discussed earlier, but also perhaps from the quiet luxury aesthetic that communicates wealth in today's culture. pressure. While Cyberpunk did not invent capitalist dystopia, Metropolis was already breaking that ground back in 1927, I think it represents the resurgence of class tensions in the modern day. As we watch technology accelerate the ascent of the ultra-rich to not only leverage their wealth for private comfort, but for political prestige and power. Hey, it's Haggard Editing Ellie here, and I just have to say the resemblance between today's billionaires and our comic book supervillains of the past couple decades is staggering. Just putting it out there. I think we have the unenviable position in 2025 of having inherited 100 years of anxiety without much permanent resolution. We still develop technology faster than we can understand its consequences, we still fear apocalypse, we still struggle against the robber barons, and we are perhaps slowly losing those glimpses of optimism shining through the smoke. I am a strong believer that the best science fiction tells us something about our present. The hopes and fears we hold today shape the look and feel of the worlds that we imagine tens, hundreds, even thousands of years from now. And so the aesthetics of these works of fiction are not just pretty set dressing, but integral parts of the narrative. I wonder what the video essayists of the future will say about the science fiction films set in our present, like Interstellar or Arrival. What themes will they attribute to the styles that are contemporary to us, but that will be retrofuturistic in several decades? As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy my little video essays on history, fashion, and art, I hope you'll like and subscribe. And if you're interested in following the progress of my gothic jacket design, you can follow Lorica Clothing on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, where I tend to post more of my business stuff. But I'll see you next time. Stay shiny.